Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This is really a pleasure and a joy to be able to share some of my perspectives and experiences on this topic. And this is a very broad topic, and I'm only going to scratch the surface, but hopefully give you some insights into the topic of the climate crisis, the energy transition, and the intersecting role of the states and the feds. And I'm also very pleased to see some of the students from my class here, who I hope will ask some penetrating questions. So, according to the New York Times, the climate crisis is the hardest joint project humanity has ever taken on. And they made this statement during Climate Week. So I thought this was a pretty profound comment from one of their articles. So what I'm going to do today is to provide you with an overview of the energy transition from a fossil fuel to clean energy over the next 30 years, talk about some drivers of this change and decision-making, and then focus on generation within clean energy policies for the states. And my own perspective is, and I'm teaching at Fletcher, which is a school of global ideas and thoughts, but in many respects, when you look at energy and environment, you really can't do it without thinking about the states. So let's start first, though, globally, and we're in an apocalypse. I think there's no way of denying the crisis, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Asia, the United States, it's flood or fire, and we just have to say that is the urgency of now, and something that even 30 years future can only get worse if we don't act. So who are some of the actors and how do you look at the perspective? And again, this is a very wordy slide, but the comment is Greta Thunberg. What does she think? She says, we have to start over. We cannot go with the establishment. Let's be change agents. And really, she has mobilized the youth of the world. Then we have John Kerry, a consummate diplomat, constantly going to conferences of the party, willing to plod and visit and move forward in that way. And he's always an optimist. My hat goes off to him for his willingness to do this. And he's done it for many years. And then there's somebody like Al Gore. And Al Gore is an interesting person in the sense that he's really made an investment right now in climate. And what really got me about this quote, digging and drilling and pumping. For the first time, we have an establishment person in Climate Week this past September, of taking on the fossil fuel companies, this digging, drilling, and pumping. So that's just a thought on how he's approaching it at this moment. So the underlying concept to all of this, and the word that you hear, is net zero. And the net zero in itself is just a simple concept, which as relates to emissions is what you produce, you have to remove from a climate perspective. But I think that the term net zero has gotten a bigger meaning today. It's also sort of a social and a political concept as well. So to reach net zero, though, it's just more than that, because we're going to have to develop governance, we're going to have accountability, and we're going to have reporting. So for me, one of the themes of the whole climate, greenhouse gas, governance, accountability, and reporting is really something that is part of the transition. So fossil fuels are the starting point. And, you know, we can look at renewables and think we've made progress, but the reality of our situation at this point is that fossil fuels are here to stay for a period of time. And I think it's just the truth that we don't like to think about as we move into the transition. And the reason is global. China, India are committed to economic growth, and they're not going to be able to do it without fossil fuels, and it's going to be hard to wean them from coal, and they're willing, and China's willing to export it to Africa and other countries. The interesting question is the role of natural gas. What is the role of natural gas? We've always thought of natural gas as the transition fuel. But more and more, we're thinking that maybe it's not the transition fuel. And this is coming from somebody who worked for a gas company, who got her start in regulating gas utilities. Gas, when it's burned in a power plant, emits less carbon dioxide than coal. And methane doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but methane is a blanket. I look at methane as a blanket. The problem is, and again, everyone says no fossil fuel, and many of you are out there demonstrating against natural gas. It's a very difficult transition to have happen. We feel a sense of urgency. We have an enormous infrastructure. And what people don't realize about getting off of gas as a heating fuel is that somebody has to pay for it. And that is the essence of a problem as well. So yes, natural gas is a problem. It may or may not be the transition fuel that we once believed, but like everything else, moving away from it from an infrastructure position is not easy. So who are the key emitters of the world? China, the United States, Europe, India, Russia. It's just sort of good to get a sense of who we're talking about from a global perspective. Of course, if you looked at it on a per capita basis, China, may not look so bad, and of course we look terrible. But I think it's really the real numbers that are the important thing for us to be aware of. So what has the world looked like over the last century? And we can take a century view because that's more comfortable for all of us. And we really see that there has been a tremendous increase in greenhouse gases. What I always find interesting is that the COVID period actually was such a deep reduction for all of us. We weren't driving, airplanes weren't going back and forth. So, that's not a good sign of COVID, but it did have an impact on carbon. So also, let's look at it by fuel trend. And this, again, is a very short-term view. What we see is coal continues to rise. Natural gas is fairly steady. There was a drop in oil, particularly during COVID, but as we're back to driving, we're seeing an increase in that. So energy supply and demand is dynamic. And we have to also think of it in that same way. Where we are today and where we're going to depend on technological innovation. We're going to depend on energy efficiency and, of course, policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is, particularly in buildings, is really critical. And we have to start thinking a lot more about energy efficiency, buildings, the role of greenhouse gas emissions in the whole building sector. So I think that's an area that we need greater focus on. The role of energy companies is still strong. We have Al Gore, the drilling, the pumping issue. And to think that they spend less than 5% of their budget on low emissions, even though they may try to, picture themselves as being interested in cutting down on emissions. And they're companies, they're there to maximize profits and stock prices. And that may seem to all of you like a dirty word, but depending on who the investor is, if you're an investor in a utility, for example, oftentimes you're a grandmother. Pension funds make great invest a lot in utilities. So, life isn't totally black and white as we think about this. And as I said, as much as we don't like it, we do have a dependency, at least in the short term, on fossil fuel. The other issue that we really have to think about is the global north-south division on all of this. And as the global South wants to develop, who are we in the global North to say, well, you know, we caused the problem, now you have to deal with it. And this is really a question of energy equity. So the growth in emissions is going to happen, you know, in the global South. And that is part of the international equity issue that I think this COP, the Conference of the Parties coming up, is going to deal with. So again, a little bit more on the North-South division, just looking at where and what sectors are consuming our energy. It's interesting to see that for the global South, it really is in the growth area, transportation. So it's just, these are just numbers to be aware of when we think of these issues. This is the point of caution. And as part of this global North-South issue, are we creating the clean energy transition on the back of exploitation? Have things not changed so much in the world that we're living in? Because every cell phone, every Tesla, every, you know, car, EV is going to require the every computer is going to require the critical minerals. You know, where are they mined? What are the condition of the workers? You know, that can induce more guilt, and maybe we should be feeling guilty. And maybe there should be a line in every Tesla. You may be feeling good, but you really shouldn't. I mean, again, these are very serious issues. There's a great book, Cobalt Red, which I recommend highly. So as we feel good about our EVs, we just have to have a little bit of realism as well. So in the United States, what we're seeing is that power, electricity, the decline of emissions is quite significant, and that's a little bit what we'll talk about, or significant. Buildings are very important. Transportation, again, it depends on all of us to buy electric cars, but feel a little guilty in the process. And we should feel good about renewables. We are seeing more renewables coming into the mix, but it's not as, even if you're an optimist, you could get excited about it, but understand that it's not as great as we need. And within, on the bottom of the slide, you have to look at each of the renewables separately. They're not all the same. PV, photovoltaics, utility are large scale utility projects. These will be your big solar farms at 500 to 800 megawatts. So I think actually the dividing line between large utility and non-utility is 50 megawatts, but the large solar farms, PV, the distributed solar farm, the distributed solar on our roof, which is a whole nother story. Onshore wind, offshore wind, Professor Hines has joined us. We have a real expert in our room on that topic. Hydropower, which over the years has been controversial, particularly hydropower from Canada. Bioenergy, which in itself, biomass, can cause a lot of problems. Professor Muma at Tufts is an expert on that topic. So things look good, but every renewable fuel has its own issues and problems as we get into it. And just as a point of fact, solar, which we all may love, at least in theory, try to cite solar today, and you're going to have a lot of problems because people don't want trees taken down for solar farms. They don't want the reflection. I am a victim of small-scale onshore wind. We tried that in Massachusetts. No one wanted to live next to a windmill, though they didn't love solar, though they don't love cell towers, but they seem to accept them more. So this is US policy framework. And that's what, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with this topic, I thought I would put in a slide that sort of talked about focusing on the electric power system, the different federal agencies and state agencies that are required to create energy policy. This becomes very, very important. So at the federal government, obviously Congress will make laws, promulgate laws, which then the different agencies have to implement. So there are many agencies implementing energy, from agriculture and places we may not think. The key ones, just from my perspective at the moment, are the Congress, the Department of Energy, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, which I will describe in a minute, the Department of Interior, which is doing offshore wind leases. So FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the key word is Regulatory Commission. That is the agency in the federal government that regulates transmission lines. I don't know, as you drive along the highway, if you get very excited to see transmission lines, I get very excited to see them a lot. And the economic and the regulation of transmission is regulated by the FERC. They also regulate gas pipelines that go interstate. They operate like a court in certain respects. They're a very important agency, which you don't know much about. The Department of Interior now is working on offshore wind leasing and also implements a lot of environmental laws. At the state level, we have the legislatures, the state energy and environmental agencies, and public utility commissions. So what we did in Massachusetts, and I think New York has done the same thing, is we combined energy and the environment. You said we can't look at energy separate from the environment. And that was a thing that Deval Patrick did when he became governor. And I think that New York has done the same thing. Most states still see them separately. Public utility commissions are really interesting organizations. They regulate investor-owned utilities, which are monopolies. So they regulate the rates, but they do other things. And they regulate the contracts that these utilities sign to supply us with energy. All of the offshore wind contracts have to go through the Department of Public Utilities. It's a quasi-regulatory agency that operates the court of law. If you want to make a change, it is very difficult to understand how this agency works, how you need to come in front of it so that things happen in a blink of an eye, even though they don't move that quickly, and you haven't made, you can't make the changes you want. So the public utility commissions are very important to energy and particularly electric power. And then local governments control siting and have a lot of environmental regulations as well. So in terms of the United States, it's interesting to see primary energy consumption by source. Just to realize the role that natural gas plays. Petroleum is obviously business and transportation, and we see renewable energy, and to think that a lot of renewable energy now is becoming onshore wind. So that is exciting. And natural gas we've talked about. And then underneath is just the amount of consumption. So I think we talked a lot about the way that the federal government does implement energy policy, but to think that the energy transition is contained in all of these laws, and they implicate and have a lot of effect on how change happens. To me, the most exciting act in all of this is the Clean Air Act. It was promulgated in 1963 under, I'm just trying to think, it might have been a Republican Congress, or anyhow, at that point, before we were so divided between left and right, there was a common belief in the importance of clean air. It came out of the Silent Spring when people realized the impacts of pollution. And it's a law that has been amended time and time again, but it remains a very effective law for the electric power section and for the transportation sector. The Supreme Court has been trying to reduce its power, but I'm hopeful that that is not going to happen over time. And then the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is also very important. The other agency that I added on an executive office position is Department of State. And the reason for that is that climate is a national security concern. There is no way that we should not understand that global insecurity, refugees, migration, all of that is very tied to climate. And the Department of State really has the oversight of many of those issues. So the game changer has been the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and we can really talk about it. People get very excited about it. It's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And the idea is to invigorate capacity, retain what is clean, retire what is fossil, and retrofit what is necessary. And this is where sort of the hope of America is right now. We know we can't put a tax on carbon. It's a congressional political non-starter. So we're working around and trying other ways to do it. And it's a cutting of emissions, lowering the cost of clean technologies to make them cost competitive with fossil fuels. Of course, the fossil fuel companies are the ones that are very excited about that. And our goal is to get net emissions down. And if you really want to look at a report that is the most thorough report that I've seen on this, the Congressional Research Service broke down sector by sector and analyzed it. And I have the link here. And I think since this talk will be online, you can click on that. But it is the most thorough analysis and helpful that I've seen. So we talked a little bit about what is happening in the state. So I talked about the public utility commissions, the environmental agencies, and states have really been on the cutting edge of energy implementation for the last 25 years. It's almost been sort of silent, but I'm very proud to have been part of a lot of that in Massachusetts, where we really focused on very early on that. And I can tell you that when I was a public utility commissioner, I wrote an order on the first greenhouse gas reduction order and told that the utilities that they needed to implement it. The Coal Association and all the utilities went to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, and the Supreme Judicial Court said that we as a Public Utility Commission could not regulate the environment. So they've changed the law, and now the Public Utility Commission feels that they can play a greater role in environmental as well as energy regulation. The exciting states are the New England states, New York, and California. Other states, and I'm going to show you a picture and a map, are also doing other things, but if you're looking for leadership, you have to look first of all to California and then to the East Coast. So how do the states do this? And this I'm going to get into in a little detail, but not a lot. The most important tool that we have in the states are called renewable portfolio standards. We can limit the amount of, or we can support renewable energy through establishing an amount that the utilities and all generators and all purchasers of electricity have to meet in terms of renewable energy. We also can do that on clean energy. Now, clean energy and renewable energy are not the same thing, and we can debate sometimes what is clean. But we also have clean energy standards. And the way that renewable energy portfolio standards operates is something called RECs, which I will go into in a minute. Renewable energy certificates. They're complicated, but they work. And the other thing is, and I say this a lot, is energy efficiency. The states are playing a major role in energy efficiency. I'm sure you've all gotten flyers from your utilities. But the big thing now that all of the cities really need to think about is net zero energy in buildings. If you can go into Starbucks and find out how many calories you consume, and which is a killer, I'm sure, for many of us in ordering, you could find out whether a building that you are moving into, what its energy efficiency rating is. If you can regulate a restaurant for cleanliness, we should be able to do this. Now, this is very complicated, and the real estate industry does not love these, and these types of regulations, and they fight them, but they are now happening and are underway. I think even in New York City, you can actually now see it on a building, and I'm sure Boston is coming to that as well. So these are the states and cities which have clean energy reduction goals. And what you find is that in red states, it is the cities that are taking the lead as well. So cities are very important in all of this. And I'll talk about the goals in the next slide as well. But you also see a pattern here, what's in the middle versus what's on the coast. And some of the, I don't know what you call them, the purple states have taken steps as well. So these are the renewable and clean energy standards. This gets you into the numbers. It's a busy slide, I know, but it's something to look into. And the difference is you see the distinction between a goal, a standard, a clean energy standard, and a clean energy goal versus a renewable portfolio standard. And most states are moving toward these standards and are tightening them. We have a few states that have eliminated them and are loosening them. But on a whole, I would say the movement is to tighten. So as I said, California leads the way, and they have set milestones in decarbonizing their economy, and all of the quote unquote progressive states also have pathways. This is so challenging. I cannot tell you how challenging it is. Just think of who energy stakeholders are. It gets very complicated. You get down to the grassroots level, but this is really where you need to go in doing this. And that's why states are on the cutting edge, because they're the people closest, they're the entities closest to the people. And this is right for them. What are the appropriate technologies for the individual states? Should it be onshore wind, as we have in the Midwest, which you couldn't get in Massachusetts, but you can get with the wind down the plains in Oklahoma and in Texas and in Kansas, versus offshore wind? And then alignment of policies and institutions. This is your problem. This is a problem for the future. And how do we communicate all of this? The complexities again, and really you have to realize that there's no black and white in all of this. It has to understand in the communication though, who do we trust? What information can we get? When do we give them this information? I'll just tell you briefly that, for example, public utility notices are in newspapers, in these little boxes in newspapers. It used to be when I was a PUC commissioner. Today, who's reading the newspapers, I think that they are now on the internet, and who's even thinking about that when you see that your neighborhood is going to have a power plant or a transmission line. And then the transition of jobs and energy justice. Again, it's my last bullet. It shouldn't be my last bullet. I think it should be my first bullet. And what Professor Hines will tell you is that the energy transition in offshore wind is totally about jobs, supply chain. That is what happens, but try to start to create them. It becomes not an easy thing. And then of course, energy justice has a lot of meaning as to where you sit, where you're located, what your history has been, and we have to tie it to economics and the histories of lack of privilege, and that's a part of this. And then the other issue for us is durability of policy. As you change an administration, and policies change, it's a disaster. And even the car companies will tell you, if you told us what you want in terms of mileage per gallon or EVs, we will do it. We will change our industry. But when you start to go back and forth and your policies are not durable, that becomes problematic. And the one thing about the Clean Air Act, it has demonstrated durability since 1973. Yes, it changes, but what you need is durability of policy. So as I said, these renewable portfolio standards, I think, are something that we need to learn a little bit more about because they really have improved the generation in the power system. So you see it can be done. That most states, or a lot of states, have these mandated requirements, and some states have voluntary requirements, but really, let's move to more renewable energy. And the way that they do this is something called a REC, these renewable energy certificates. So when you generate electricity now from a clean energy source, you generate the electricity and you generate a certificate. And that certificate is an environmental attribute equal to 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. So clean power plants both give you electricity and they give you this environmental certificate. Even if you generate clean electricity, but you don't have a REC associated with it, it doesn't count as clean electricity. So the other thing is that RECs, once they are used or once they, you claim them, they have to be taken out of circulation. So buying power from a wind farm without buying the associated RECs does not make you clean. And then once you claim your REC, you can't reclaim it again, so it can't be counted. And the other thing about RECs is, yes, there's a compliant RECs, which I talked about that the states use, but then a REC can also operate in the private market. And a REC is a tradable market-based instrument that represents legal property rights to renewables. So companies that claim you are getting clean energy are because they have bought RECs. So even if the power that goes into the grid nearby is dirty, that company, if it enabled a wind farm 500 miles away or several states away, can claim that it is clean because they have bought RECs. So don't think that, just understand that there's a separation between clean energy or renewable energy and the actual power that is going into the grid. So a REC is a really good thing, and it has a monetary value, and people will be buying RECs, and there's a private market for RECs as well. The other thing that the states have done that is very impressive is called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the closest thing that we have come to a cap and trade as well. And 12 states along the East Coast have gotten together, and there's a great history to all of this, as anything there is to anything, and have established a set of allowances that impact the generators in the states where they are part of this compact. And there is an auction held, and it's like any other cap and trade auction. And once the money is established from the auction, based on some sharing measurement among the states can use the money for whatever they want. And we have noted that from 2009 to 2020, RGGI contributed 46% reduction in carbon emissions from electric power plants and raised money from selling those allowances. And now a lot of that is used for either energy efficiency in the states or low-income programs. So there's a social aspect to RGGI as well. So in terms of renewables, there are also procurements for wind and solar. And the important thing to know is that the states have established a very strong procurement process if the utilities are buying from these clean energy developments. And right now, offshore wind is really in the mix, and there are a whole set of procurements going on, and we're very happy to discuss them. But the federal government wants to reach 30 gigawatts by 2030 in an industry that is being developed, and meeting all of these targets will be very complicated. Onshore wind is particularly strong in Texas, which is actually the leader in onshore wind, Iowa, California, and Oklahoma. And finally, just let's look at where solar is across the country. There are the major big solar utility plants, and then we have the small scale solar electricity, and that will include rooftop solar. And finally, just to give you a sense of offshore wind, we are talking about major procurements along the coast. And also California is not as far as the East Coast is at this moment, but California offers a whole set of opportunities as well. The other thing that California has done is they just have sued big oil. Now, this is really an interesting topic as to whether or not they will be successful, but the other states have done is we do have a history of states suing the federal government, at least under the Clean Air Act. And now California says, you have ruined our state. We have fires, we have floods. Also, you knew, fossil fuel companies, the impact of your fuel. We want you now to reward us, create an abatement fund. It will be amazing if how this case gets handled, but it does show that the states really do play a major role on all levels. So here we are. We have enormous challenges coming forward. We have, but I put a little green leaf because I'm hopeful. Siting of transmission and generation will fall a lot to the states. This is big issues on how we handle it, not only on the federal level, but the state level and siting. This focus on environmental and energy justice is huge. It's a game changer. People who have not been part of the process will finally have the opportunity to have their voices heard. And I don't think that the utilities, and I don't think that the generators understand the impact of this yet, but this is going to have a major role on decision making. But affordability and fairness, this is a very expensive transition. Who's going to pay for it? And when are we going to pay for it? And we have this embedded system of infrastructure and utility rates. And there are all sorts of cross subsidies right now in our utility rates and in the costs and prices that we pay for energy. And when those become transparent, which they should, but then they get removed, it's going to cost all of us a lot more. And that's something that we, those are some of the trade-offs that we have to be willing to think about as we make changes. So are there ways gradually of making changes? We're not going to pull out the gas lines tomorrow. We may wish we could pull out the gas lines tomorrow. If we don't pull out the gas lines tomorrow and we have gas leaks, should we not repair them? I mean, again, how much money are we being spent to repair the gas leaks if we think that eventually we're going to be pulling out the gas line? So again, these are policy questions of the moment. Not that there are easy answers, but we're going to have to discuss them. So decarbonization of the grid means both the growth of a mega grid, a national grid, which we are now beginning to talk about, and Professor Hines has a lot of opportunities and thinking about that from his perspective. But the other thing is these microgrids. So we're in an interesting position where if we create microgrids and can contain in areas as well, at least during this period of resiliency, which we also need to invest in, that may be good investment as well. Ooh, wait a minute, that. So in conclusions, a lot of these decisions are happening at the state level. And decisions we make today are going to have 50-year impacts. This is hard for you to believe, but since I have been in this field for 50 years, somebody was kind to say 40, I can tell you that the decisions that we made then, and energy efficiency is one that I am proud of that we made about 40 years ago. These decisions are going to hang a long time because infrastructure lasts much longer than you think it does. And just think of that in buildings and dams and highways and everything else. States are critical to the technology policy interface. And one of the issues is that we need more engineers who understand policy and more policy people who understand engineering. We at the states have a strong history. When we had the Trump administration and the federal government was not valuing clean energy and the transition, all the activities switched to the states. Now where you have a partner in the federal government, it's still the states and the federal government. The other thing for the states is we're on the front lines. And there's just no way of looking at it any other way. So we're going to have to make decisions about mitigation, which are, lowering emissions, but also adaptation, how we're going to spend our money. Are we going to build seawalls? Is that how you want to do it? Or do you want to take another long-term view? These are big questions that happen at the state level. The other thing is the states are going to have to be innovators, and they're going to have to find the solutions that work for their citizens. So I don't think there's a one approach fits all, but we have to work and figuring out what will work for us in New England versus maybe something that may work in North Carolina. And the other thing is we're all critical participants in this transition. This is to all of us in the room and all of us in the community, and carrying it up to the state level, because this transition is happening and it is the future. So those are my slides, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that great overview of the field. While people collect their thoughts, I would like to start with a follow-up question about the critical participants and funding that you were mentioning one slide ago. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the role of public and private partnerships in funding this transition to more renewable energy, and maybe even mention some examples of this happening already?
Well, first of all, public-private partnerships are really critical to having this happen. And I guess that you can look at that in several different ways. So first of all, I think that there's more money in some of these acts that have been, particularly the Infrastructure Act, where you can begin to develop the whole public-private partnership. One place to do it is in the green bank area. So one of the most interesting things, and this is where states can play a role, is that they can make investments. They can make it easier to make investments, for example, on putting solar on your roof. If you want to get charging stations. So the green banks are, to me, the future of some of this financing and partnership opportunities. So that's really where I think that New York has a very viable green bank. Connecticut, Massachusetts is in the process of developing it. So that's one area. The other area is that I think that the private sector is not yet there, but they're starting to recognize their ties to the community on clean energy. So I think that we're going to see a lot of sort of funding. I'm part of an organization called Power Options. Power Options does many things, but they're trying to figure out how to be a vehicle on buildings. This building transition, this BERDO it's called, this building energy transition is one where you're going to need partnerships, because companies that have to now upgrade their buildings, some of them don't have the financing, they don't have the money. So we're going to have to figure out that's another area where I could see community partnerships and building environments that the community likes. That is another way to sort of look at these partnerships so that you're not, it's like we tore down the Southeast Expressway in Boston because we realized it destroyed the city of Boston. And now we have the South, all that's happening in all different areas of the city and the Greenway. So I think that those are the places where we're going to see the opportunities. And the building sector is one that I would really look at.
Thank you.
Juliet.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor. I had a question about some of the different objectives and targets that each state individually held in terms of decarbonization and how the federal government is seeking to reconcile those under the more general sustainable development goals. So will that mean, will we see more federal involvement at the state level to realize these?
I think we will over a period of time. I think that the states are counting on the federal government to provide funding and leadership along the way, particularly where their programs are very compatible with federal goals. So I think what's happened is that the states are all scrambling for funding from the federal government, which will come. But funding from the federal government always will come with strings. And one of the big strings I think we're going to see is on energy justice. So we're going to see an interaction of federal funding and transportation, federal funding on these building projects, federal funding eventually in aspects related to supply chain development and offshore wind. But it never comes without a price. And I think that the states are competing for this money. It will happen. What worries, but the good thing is these are laws and they are now baked in the cake. So even if the administrations will change, you will see money flowing, but the federal government can reduce budgets. It can, I don't think it can totally eliminate programs, but it cannot make them happen. So I think that we have to be cautious and not create a bubble of funding. And also this issue of accountability. We're going to have to account for our funding and make sure that we do it in a way that is accountable and transparent and just doesn't become seen as a boondoggle, because at that point we'll hurt what we were trying to help.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You have a question?
Hi, so you talked some about like the expense of the energy transition. Now, I know it's often said that like solar and maybe even like onshore wind is now cheaper than fossil fuels, although I know there are also concerns about like storage and like retiring infrastructure early. So yeah, I'm curious how you would respond to those claims.
But that renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So I think that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels in certain respects. The issue of scale is really important. The issue of technology is very important. And all of that is, that is true. But we have an infrastructure that is in place. And what we don't realize is how that operates when you are generating electricity in a market. So even though the solar panels are now reduced in price, two things happen. If we, for example, go to, it's called the duck curve. Have you ever heard of the duck curve? Okay, the duck curve is something that happens when you have a lot of solar in your mix, but you know that you are eventually going to have to use your fossil fuel. So in a day, our electricity, we start in the morning, we ramp up to the middle of the day, then we all come home, we're using a lot, and then all of a sudden at night, we stop using or we reduce our energy use. What happens is that in the middle of the day, we have a lot of solar. Okay. What happens at the end of the day is the sun doesn't shine. And now we need to rely on power plants to provide us the electricity that we need at night. Though at that point, you have these big plants that can't ramp up and down quickly. They have to leave these plants running. Otherwise, they can't come up when we need them. So we create all of these economic disconnects in a system, and fossil fuel plants then will run for a period of time at zero, and then they'll be forced to ramp up. And the costs of all of this aren't spread fairly among the population. The other thing that happens is that when you and I put solar on our roof, that's great for us. But what about all the people who can't put solar on the roof or can't afford it? They are paying for our putting solar on the roof and are sending solar into the grid because they're still paying the fixed cost of the system, but not enjoying the benefits of the cheaper electricity. So these, even if we see costs reducing, there are all of these unfair allocations that are happening at the same time. So the price, so the infrastructure price may be down, but the cost to society may not be there. And that's the point that I just think we have to think about as we go through the transition. It's not that we shouldn't do it, but we should realize that at every moment, there is a cost and a benefit to a different group of people. And the issue of reliability is something that we have to think about too. As much as we don't like to think about it, can you imagine at 11 o'clock at night, if you wanted to write a paper or something and all of a sudden you were in a brownout situation? You would not be a happy person. So I'm just saying that these are trade-offs that we have to think about.
We are at time, so I'm
Okay.
going to invite anybody else who has questions to come to talk to Professor
Thank you.
Kates-Garnick, and let's thank her one more time. And come back next week for the politics of food.